Hi, welcome everyone to this episode, which is episode 5 of the Caravan of Consciousness. And tonight I've got the honour and pleasure of having Mark Devlin as my guest. Mark is a UK-based club and radio DJ, music journalist, author and public speaker. Inspired by the work of the late Dave McGowan, the author of Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, Mark took up the mantle and continued to independently research the inner machinations of the music industry. This research led to the publication of Musical Truth Volume 1 in 2016, and there are now 2 more volumes in this trilogy, which dive deep into the darker side of the music industry and expose its long-hidden secrets, signs, and symbols. Mark also published his debut novel entitled The Cause and the Cure in 2020, with its sequel coming out soon. Mark has a podcast called Good Vibrations, in which he interviews interesting guests on many subjects, including the true nature of reality, spirituality, consciousness, social engineering, mind control, conspiracy, and much, much more. He also has his weekly DJ show, The Sound of Now, showcasing new soulful, uplifting house-inspired music, and his show, The Sound of Freedom, where he plays conscious music from the free-spirited and wildly creative artists. Mark also tours the UK and beyond with his talks on the subject matter of his many years of researching the music and entertainment industries, social engineering, and a wide variety of other topics. Welcome, Mark.
Amanda, great to be with you, and I'm feeling tired just listening to all of that.
Can you believe you actually do all that?
Well, it's not until you hear it put like that that you realize just how damn busy you are. But yeah, yes. I do all that stuff that you mentioned. Great to be with you. I would say good morning. It is morning for me, but it's evening for you.
It is.
And I feel like I already know you because we've been corresponding for a long time, but we still haven't met in person. So we've got to put that right at some stage.
Exactly. Yeah, we were so close to meeting back in March 2020. You were due to come out to Australia to do your tour. I think it was you were touring the book The Cause and the Cure that you had just released. And that's right. Yeah, and you were going to be in Brisbane for a couple of nights, and then I think it was Sydney and then Perth. And I think it was only a couple of days, 2 or 3 or maybe 4 days before you were due to fly out, that the dreaded, you know what happened, and put a stop to all that. So, yeah.
I can remember the dates. It was Monday, the 16th of March, 2020, when I was due to fly out to Australia.
Yeah.
And I was going to be starting the tour on the Thursday of that week. It was going to be Brisbane on the Thursday, then Sydney on the Saturday, and Perth on the Sunday.
Yeah.
And I remember corresponding with you at the time because all the madness was starting to ramp up, and there was all the fear propaganda and all the hysteria about the you know what. And I had to decide whether I was going to risk coming out there but maybe not being able to get back, or just cancel the whole thing. And I had to make the sensible decision to cancel the whole thing on the Monday. And by the Friday of that week, Boris Johnson had plunged the UK into lockdown, and we were told you couldn't go anywhere or do anything. So in retrospect, it was the right decision. Danny Rampling, the well-known DJ, is actually a friend of mine, and he said that he got the last flight out of Perth before everything shut down. So he managed to get out just a few days before I was due to, and he was doing a DJ tour. And the flight that he jumped on to get out of Perth when everything was starting to lock down was the last opportunity anyone had to leave. So he was damn lucky as well. He managed the trip. I didn't quite manage it.
Yeah, wow. And I'm so glad that you stuck to your guns, because I remember when you first started corresponding with me about what was coming. And I'm like, oh, it'll blow over, don't worry about it, you know, and because we had everything sorted, and I really didn't, because like many of us, I don't watch mainstream news or, you know, and so I was totally oblivious really to a lot of what was going on. And it wasn't until I had friends and family and other people say, oh, did you hear about the, you know, this and that, rah, and I'm like, oh, really? And so I still took it quite lightly right up until the very last minute. And then when you sort of said, no, I can't come, I don't, I'm like, okay. And then we had to scramble around. You had to actually do a pre-recorded video because we still had the venue here booked. We still had, even though a lot of people had pulled out, but we still had about 20, 25 people, I think, came that night. So you actually had pre-recorded a video, and also thankfully Jason and Crow from Crow 777 Radio did a video as well for us. So the night still went ahead, but not as planned. So, but anyway.
Yeah. I mean, what a bloody nightmare it all was. Nobody could ever have predicted that it would pan out the way it did. And like you, I thought it was going to be a short-lived thing that would blow over. Even in spite, I've said this many times, even in spite of all the research that I've done over many, many years into the nature of the conspiracy and the New World Order master plan and the overlords that we have controlling every aspect of our lives, I never would have imagined that they would have the audacity to try and pull a stunt like this off. And here we are, what is it now? 2.5 years later, getting on for 3 years later. And we all know the way the world has been. And I don't think any of us could ever have predicted that it would turn out this way.
No.
And now we're just viewing everything from an entirely different perspective.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny because my son, at the time when it first kicked off, he actually said to me, "Don't worry, Mum, it won't last long. It's made in China." Oh boy, was he wrong.
Good one. I know, right?
Yeah. Anyway, so let's get back on track with tonight's show. So what I really want to do tonight, we're just sort of free flowing here. There's no sort of real set out thing, but just touching on your awakening journey and then your work to date, and how you got from being a DJ and doing sort of what you were doing then as to what you're doing now. So if you want to start basically with your awakening journey, when did you first realize that the world that we live in is not as we thought it was?
Well, if I take it all the way back, I was very little when a couple of things occurred to me. One was that I couldn't understand why Britain had a royal family. I couldn't understand why one family above all others were elevated to this position of apparent power and extreme wealth. It just seemed very unfair to me. And so I questioned that. And also, when I was very little, I questioned why people kill animals to eat them. Because I was raised in a family where we ate meat. And when I was very little, I just assumed that they waited for the animals to die before they would eat their bodies. And when I found out that the animals are actually killed specifically so that they can be eaten, I was horrified. And I was very little. I was probably about 7 or 8 at the time. And I remember those two things really had an impression on me. But anyway, I carried on through life, and I was living very much in normie land, just doing regular stuff that everyone does. In my 20s, I went through a period of, first of all, believing that I was a Christian, a born-again Christian. Round about 1989, 1990, I started to feel differently about the world and my place in it. And it's interesting because it's round about that time that David Icke talks about having his awakening and having these spiritual messages conveyed to him. Right around that time, I felt like I was tapping into something as well, but I didn't know what it was. And this steered me off into a period of attending a Christian church with an aunt of mine who kind of embraced this situation and said, oh, it's a calling from the Lord. So she brought me into the church. And after 4 years, I left that. And I felt very disillusioned with what I'd seen within the church in terms of the way people behaved. It seemed to me to be like a big club, like the Freemasons. It was different generations of the same family that were brought into the church hierarchy. And this actually caused me to become an atheist. I was quite bitter, and I thought, well, there's no God, there's no spirituality. So I spent many years under the delusion of atheism, and I read the works of Richard Dawkins. It's incredible to me now to think this, but I read The God Delusion by Dawkins and went along with all of that. But I was also reading books by Graham Hancock in the 90s, I remember reading Fingerprints of the Gods when that came out in 95, and that had a really profound effect on me. It really made me think about human history and the nature of this world and this reality and all that kind of stuff. And then eventually I got onto the books of David Icke, and I was put onto these by my dad. My dad has always been a sort of armchair philosopher. So he's someone that's always been a deep thinker, but he never really did anything with it. He just sat there and sort of mused and reflected late at night in his armchair. And he read all these books by all these amazing authors like Erich von Däniken and Zecharia Sitchin. And he was also into David Icke. So he encouraged me to read the books of David Icke. And they made so much sense to me at that time. So this was around 2007, that sort of period. And I found that Icke's books answered so many of the big questions that I'd had in life. So the world had always seemed unfair to me. It had always seemed unjust. I couldn't comprehend why there were always wars and there was always conflict and famine and poverty. And Icke's books made me realize that all that stuff is there because the world is set up that way. It's supposed to be that way, according to those who really run the world. And so what I really wanted to know is how this entire dynamic, once I'd got a grasp on it and I'd accepted that I'd been lied to all my life and that nothing was as it had been presented to me by the mainstream media and by governments and by schools, what I really wanted to know is how that played out in the music industry, which I'd been a part of as a DJ, because I realized that that had been manipulated and controlled and steered off and conflicted in just the same way as the world of politics and the world of science and the world of everything else. So that became my specialist area of interest. And I threw myself with a zealous evangelical passion into researching the true nature of the music industry. And I really got down in earnest to doing that in about 2010. And the result of my first 5 years worth of research was my first Musical Truth book, which I wrote through 2014 and 2015, and that was published in early 2016. And as you said at the start of the show, that kickstarted everything else, and it's been nonstop since. There it is. Yeah, that's right.
Yep. Yep. So when you were actually still working in the music industry as a DJ and a music journalist, I mean, I know you're still DJing now, but when you were in the thick of it and doing what you're doing, did you have any inclinations then that things were a little bit like things in the music industry didn't quite add up, or was it after you'd actually done the gone through the awakening or looking into the David Icke stuff? Like, were there little hints with people you might have interviewed that there might have been something amiss, or were you still totally oblivious at that point when you were in the thick of it?
I was totally oblivious, and it's quite embarrassing now to look back at those years and think that I couldn't see what is now so obvious to me. But because I was a part of it and I was entrenched within it, I couldn't see it.
Yeah.
And this is something I find a lot. There's a lot of doctors, seemingly, that can't see the Convid scam for what it is, and the arms spear agenda. They don't realize that it's genocidal because they're so close to it, because it's their daily life, and they can't imagine that things are any different to how they've been entrained to think of them. And it was kind of that way with me in the music industry. I was never really a cog in the machine of the industry. I always consider myself to have been on the periphery of it, sort of skating around the outside as a DJ. But I did meet a lot of artists. I interviewed a lot of artists when I was on the radio in the 90s. So I had a show dealing with R&B and hip hop. And I interviewed the late Aaliyah, round about the time that she's said to have been in a relationship with R. Kelly. Lots to say about that dude. So it's emerged that R. Kelly and Aaliyah actually got married when Aaliyah was 15 years of age, because that's the kind of guy R. Kelly is. And that marriage ended up being annulled. But it wasn't long after that that I met Aaliyah. And we had a chat for the radio show. I had no idea about any of this stuff that she'd been through. And of course, later she died at the age of 22 in 2001 in a plane crash, which seems deeply suspect to me. I also met Beyonce at the time that Destiny's Child first launched in early 1998, I interviewed the whole of Destiny's Child and sat next to Beyonce on a sofa when she was 16 years of age. And now I can look back and see that Beyonce is mind controlled, probably went through satanic ritual abuse. Some feel that she's possessed by entities. She's got Jay-Z in place as her mind control handler. She's been pushing any number of elite control system agendas through her music and her imagery and all of this. So I can see that now, but I couldn't see it then. And the other thing is, through the 90s into the early noughties, I was a DJ playing hip hop music, rap and hip hop. And I can look back now and clearly see the social engineering agendas that were getting pushed through that music. So in the 90s, it was, on the one hand, the emergence of so-called gangster rap. So it was the glorification of criminal lifestyles. You had rappers boasting about how much crack they'd slung. Jay-Z, for example, was a crack dealer on the streets of Brooklyn, New York, before he became a rapper, and many other rappers were as well. And they would openly boast about this, talking about how many drugs they'd sold. Biggie Smalls, same way, Notorious B.I.G., who also died in suspicious circumstances. And then Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre and people like that, they're talking about bitches, hoes, crack, smoking weed, gold rims on your Jeep, gold chains, all this kind of thing. And then you had the emergence of commercialization of material brands. And this was coming through the likes of Puff Daddy with Bad Boy Records. He was pushing this with all his artists. It was Cristal, champagne up in the club, fur coats, gold chains, designer sunglasses, all of this. The glorification of material lifestyles. So those two agendas were running really strongly through rap and hip hop in the 90s. And I can listen back now to recordings of radio shows that I did back then, and I was playing all this stuff. And to me, it just seemed normal, nothing wrong with it, nothing wrong with rappers talking about bitches and hoes and all of this. And now I look back on it and I think this was terrible, what I was helping to push. I would never play that kind of stuff now. But back then, I was so entrenched within it. I loved the culture. I loved the lifestyle. I just lived for the parties, for the clubs, for the music. That's all I could see. So I was very naive and very blinkered back then. And I have to keep that in mind when I get pissed off with so-called normies or NPCs right now. People, regular members of society who can't see what we can see. And we can bash our heads against a wall saying, what's wrong with these people? Why won't they wake up? Why can't they see it? And so I do have to remind myself that I was in that state of degraded consciousness myself quite a long time ago.
Yeah. Well, I've got a couple of things on that. The next thing I was going to ask you is why do you think some people are under the spell and others are waking up? But before we get to that, getting back to what you were saying about how when you were in the thick of it, excuse me, you couldn't see it. It's like you can't see the wood for the trees, and how you were looking back, you feel horrified. I think, and that's that whole thing too about having no more heroes, because for me, like, I've always been into music. I've been in many bands, like played in bands, been in a musical family. And I look back now at the heroes that I had in music growing up, and some of them, like U2, like I absolutely idolized U2 growing up. And I went to concerts and, there'd be Bono with the big screen and he's got Kofi Annan from, not the World Health Organization. What is it?
United Nations.
United Nations, yeah. And at the time I just thought, oh yeah, it's all for peace and bringing all the nations together and, trying to stamp out wars and just have peace and a united front across the world. And I had these rose-colored glasses on, just thinking it was something totally different. And then all these years later to find out that it was nothing like I thought it was. And I look back now and I think, why didn't I see it then? But I mean, obviously we didn't have the information back then either, and we took everything as on face value. And I guess normal human beings that are just living their daily lives and don't have an agenda, they take things on face value and they don't think the worst because they wouldn't do something like that. So why would they expect someone else to do underhanded things? So I guess that loops back to the question is, why do you think some people are still under the spell at this late stage in the game, whereas other people are waking up? What do you make it out of that?
Well, I would like to say that back when I was getting duped and deceived by the hip hop industry, and when you were still idolizing Bono before you realized that he's a demon pushing New World Order agendas,
Yep.
it was much more difficult to, yeah, it was
Yep.
much more difficult to get truthful information because
Yep.
we're going back a long way here. With me, we're going back like 15 years. So, yes, the internet was around, but there was nowhere near the amount of information on it that there is now, nowhere near the amount of videos doing the rounds and podcasts and talks and conferences taking place. So we can kind of be a little more excused for not seeing the wood for the trees back 10, 15 years ago than folk can now, because now there's such a plethora of information available to prove to anyone that the world is nothing like it's presented to us through the mainstream, that it's very difficult to have any kind of excuse to still be asleep, I would say. And I often hear people, truther friends, and they'll say, oh, we've got to wake up the normies, and I've got to wake up these family members and my friends and stuff. And I do think to myself, how is it possible to still be asleep in late 2022? On the verge of 2023, in light of all the information that there is available, the ridiculous, absurd nature of what's being presented to us through the mainstream news, the official version of things, is so utterly ridiculous and so utterly transparent that it becomes very difficult to comprehend how anyone can't have twigged yet. And it is tempting to think that anyone who's not yet woken up is never going to. But of course, we still have to keep those efforts stepped up because it is the key to our freedom, our collective freedom, enough of us waking up to these obvious truths. So the reason why some get it and some don't, I really think happens on a soul level. I've reflected on this for a very long time, and I really do feel that there are some of us who have incarnated into this reality, and we took the decision in a higher state of consciousness, our higher selves, to undergo a life experience where we would uncover truth and where we would face up to these uncomfortable, unsettling facts, and we would use that to empower ourselves and motivate ourselves to try and free others and to stand in right action and to put some good work into the world. I don't know whether that's because we're old souls and we've been on this merry-go-round quite a few times before.
I
And
feel
with
like we
each,
are.
right, yeah,
I feel like my soul is very tired and it's probably wanting to, get to the last incarnation here. But I also feel we're on a
yeah,
rescue mission.
yeah. I think some of
Yep.
us are.
Yeah.
And I can only conclude that those who walk around in fear, wearing their masks, scurrying around, believing there's some deadly thing that's going to infect them, believing every word on the BBC Evening News or whatever the Australian equivalent is, these people who are just so susceptible to the fear, the propaganda, the mind control, would have made that decision for themselves. Maybe that's what their soul needs to grow and evolve. They're on a different journey to us, and they need to learn different things, undergo different experiences, learn different lessons. So we become very frustrated with them because we think, why can't you see what we can see? But maybe it's part of their life journey, their life plan. That's the only explanation for it that makes any kind of sense to me.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I still keep planting seeds, but I'm definitely not as gung-ho as I was initially to try and drive things home to people because it does tend to push a lot of people away. And I've noticed more and more people are starting to, even in my circle, are starting to question things or I'm getting messages sent from other family members or friends that I never would have thought in a million years would have been open to any of this sort of stuff, and they're now at this late stage just starting to, they're sending me links to things, and I'm just like, yes, there's still hope. There is still hope. So I think,
Yeah. I
yeah,
call them new recruits. We're taking on new recruits all the
yeah,
time.
yeah, and I
And
think it's
we
that
welcome them.
yeah, and I think it's that thing too, like in marketing, like if I don't know the actual the figures, but they say that if you hear something or see something a certain amount of times, then that's when the little cog turns and the little key, clicks in, and so it's probably the same for the normies, like if they keep seeing the same thing pop up, and people are saying it from all different walks of life, eventually it will start to, like, oh, well, I heard that there and so said that. And yeah, so
Yeah.
yeah.
Well,
And
normies like to go with the crowd. They like to not stand out. They like to sort of go with the flow and with what everyone else is thinking and saying. And I have seen a couple of really encouraging things actually from UK shores, which I put in my video that I released just yesterday. And it's a couple of government propaganda pieces. So the first one is crowing proudly about the 2-year anniversary of them rolling out the arms spear. And the government is saying, oh, this is a wonderful achievement. It's a landmark thing. And when you go to the comments section of this post, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of comments from people saying, we see through this. We know what you're doing. We know that this is a bioweapon. It's killing people. It's maiming people. You can't fool us. You're genocidal criminals, and justice is coming. And I found that hugely encouraging because this was a mainstream post. It wasn't on a truther website. And there wasn't one comment in there supportive of the message. And the other thing was this horrific propaganda ad that they put out featuring Santa Claus going to get his arm spear. And it was a video that was all designed to be sort of feel good and Christmassy and all this sort of thing. And again, when you look at the comments below that, people are saying, you can't disguise what this is. We can see what this is. You're criminals. You're all going to stand justice for this. And it just made me think that if that would become the mainstream way of thinking, and if somehow it becomes fashionable to question what we're being told about the safety of these things, then the normie masses are going to want to go along with that because they don't want to be different to what everyone else is thinking and saying. So it's a case of swaying public opinion in the right direction, and then the crowd will follow.
yeah,
So it is a case of reaching a tipping point. And like you, I don't know what the figures are or where we need to get to reach that tipping point, but there is encouragement to be drawn, I feel, from the fact that we may be close to that now.
yeah, exactly. I've even noticed on some of the community pages, local community, like mainstream community pages on Facebook, there's so many more people now putting things out there. So yeah, it's definitely encouraging. I do think there is this upswing of awakening happening, even at this late stage. So getting back to your research with the books, Musical Truth books that you did, you touched a bit, I think it was the first one you really sort of dove into the like, picked up where Dave McGowan left off. So do you want to go into that a little bit about like around the 60s? Because actually before we get into that, well, it's about the 60s, but I was born in the mid 60s. And I always thought I was born too late because by the time I was aware enough in the 70s about Woodstock and things like that, I thought, damn, I missed out on the best party ever. And I was always bopping away to mum's music and everything. And but now I know what I know, and I'm not even sure that Woodstock actually happened the way that we thought it did. There's actually conjecture there as to, to whether that was really a real thing. I mean, obviously something happened, but it could have been.
Yeah, Crow talks about that, doesn't he? He
Yes,
questions the
yeah,
accuracy of that.
exactly. I think someone said about the moon not being in the right phase of the videos that were brought out about the Woodstock and things like that. So, but yeah, so getting into, weird scenes inside the canyon, the 60s, the sort of counterculture movement and everything, and all the social engineering. So do you want to sort of expand a little bit on that subject?
Yeah. I also feel that I was born a bit too late, because I think if I'd been born probably 15 years earlier, I might have enjoyed the disco scene of New York, because I'm really into sort of the soulful, funky disco sound of the 1970s. Not the really cheesy stuff, not I Will Survive and YMCA, but the real funky disco stuff. And, I'm not into gay culture or drugs, but I do like the music. And I feel that if I'd been able to go to Studio 54 or the
Yep.
Paradise Garage in the late 70s, that would have been an amazing experience. And also the birth of hip hop culture in New York in the late 70s. So I was born too late to catch that. But I was born just at the right time to be rife for manipulation with the acid house rave scene, which kicked off in the UK in 1987. And then 1988 was called the Second Summer of Love. So I got caught up in all of that, the music. Again, not the drugs. I never did drugs. I'm someone that's always wanted to be in control of my own faculties. And I always felt that doing drugs would make me lose control of that. But I was always into the music. So I was into acid house and electronic dance music when that first started. But I can now see that that whole scene was the product of social engineering and culture creation. And to get a master study in how all that stuff works, which I've talked about a lot in my books and my public talks, you can go back to the 1960s and you can look at what was done with the counterculture of the mid to late 1960s. So a lot of great work on this subject was done by Jan Irvin and Joe Atwill a few years ago. They had an awesome podcast called Unspun, where they really focused on the counterculture and MK Ultra mind control coming out of the CIA in that period. And so I learned a lot from them. I also learned a lot from Dave McGowan, who you mentioned, who put out the book Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. And so the 60s counterculture scene, the official record has it that that was a grassroots organic thing. It was the youthful generation of the time that was rebelling against the value system of their parents' generation. So they were anti-war, they were pro-social justice movements and pro-feminism and pro-LSD and drugs generally. And research has now shown, and documentation which has come forward, and admissions and confessions from people that were involved in this thing, that that entire scene, that entire movement was co-opted by the CIA, and significant aspects of it were controlled by the CIA. So you got Dr. Timothy Leary, who was this Harvard professor, this academic who embraced psychedelic culture, and he advocated for young people to go on these journeys of discovery by doing LSD, also things like mescaline and peyote that was around, and psilocybin mushrooms. And then you've got Gloria Steinem, who at the same time emerged as the sort of mother of the feminist movement of the 60s, the
And
proprietor of Ms. magazine.
Sorry,
Germaine Greer
Germaine
from,
Greer. Yeah, my mother always cursed Germaine Greer.
from over
Yep.
on your side of things.
Yes.
And they were pushing feminism. And at the same time, you had these new attitudes to sex, sexual liberation, and just lifestyles generally, liberal, free sort of lifestyles, hippie values. And at the time, it seemed very natural. But now we know that Dr. Timothy Leary was an asset of the CIA. So were many of the other academics that were pushing psychedelic culture. That's got to ring some alarm bells. Then there's the fact that Gloria Steinem was also an asset of the CIA. And so many of these other key figures from the counterculture were. Ken Kesey and his merry pranksters who went around in psychedelic buses distributing LSD in Kool-Aid at all these hippie communes and music festivals and such, was an MK Ultra subject involved in mind control experimentation. Same thing with Bear Owsley Stanley. who provided the massive sound systems for many of these hippie music festivals. All of them have connections back to the CIA. The Grateful Dead was sort of the house band of that whole hippie counterculture scene. And the members of that group have some very suspect affiliations. There's connections to the CIA, but there's also connections through Bob Weir to Bohemian Grove, the Bohemian Club, and everything involved there. There's connections into Freemasonry. And we find this time and time again with the key figures coming out of the counterculture. And then when you get into Dave McGowan's work, he shows how all these bands, all these music acts coming out of Laurel Canyon in the Hollywood Hills overlooking Los Angeles had family connections to the CIA and to the Pentagon and to different aspects of government, different aspects of the establishment, to aristocratic bloodline families, Ivy League universities like Harvard and Yale. And McGowan showed that with no exceptions, all of these key artists had those kind of connections. The most famous example, of course, is Jim Morrison of the Doors and his father, who was a Navy admiral, very high ranking, and he was in charge of the fleet of ships involved in the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which springboarded America into the Vietnam War. And so Jim, the admiral's son, was effectively an actor playing a role, and he was the poster child for that whole anti-war, anti-establishment generation. He emerged as this fully formed rock god icon with the Doors virtually overnight. And they played their part. They did their thing. They pushed the culture. They pushed the drugs. They pushed the challenge to all these traditional sort of family values. And what that whole scene was all about was basically breaking down the cohesion and the unity of the traditional family unit. They wanted to split that apart. So they pushed all kinds of lifestyles and culture that would go against that. And I feel that the ripples from what was done in the 1960s are still being felt today.
Oh,
so Dave McGowan did some
yeah.
great work with his book. And I do feel that to a very large extent, I've picked up the baton from him, because he opened my eyes to the fact that these rock music icons are not quite who we thought they were. These bands didn't evolve organically just because they were great musicians. Many of them weren't. Many of the bands that emerged in the 60s and put out albums had this music recorded by studio musicians. You know, they couldn't even play their instruments. They couldn't perform live. They were just the figureheads in terms of the band. And so it's not because they were great musicians or wrote great songs that they became famous and they became the key icons in this scene. It's because of the families that they came out of. That's why they were pushed. So McGowan opened my eyes to this. And unfortunately, he passed away on the 22nd of November 2015 of an extremely fast acting and aggressive form of cancer. So we can make of that what we will.
Strange.
Yeah,
Same as Bob Marley.
Yep, that's right.
Yep.
So I sort of took up the mantle from McGowan, and I feel that he very much inspired me in the type of work that I'm doing now. And that's what I seek to expose, how counterculture how culture creation works, and how social engineering and lifetime actors work.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that whole feminism movement, as I said, my mum used to be so down on Germaine Greer because mum, she was a baby boomer and she just wanted to be a mum and a housewife and do the traditional role that for centuries women did. The men were the providers, the women were the nurturers and carers. But then, through the 60s, women were starting to be made feel guilty if they didn't go out and contribute to the family household income. So, I mean, and mum said she never wanted us to be what she called latchkey kids, coming home from school and not having. So pretty much any job she did get was part-time when us kids were at school. But she really didn't like that feminist movement, the forcing of women out into the workforce and things like that. And she could see, even long before many of us were aware of this sort of stuff, but she could see what was going on, the chipping away of the family values and the degradation of society. And she was so ahead of her time. We used to call her the bag lady because she always used to take her own shopping bags to the supermarkets long before that was a thing. And she was into recycling like back in the 70s, again, long before that was the normal thing to do. Mum was always into these things. So, yeah, so I had probably a bit of an eye opener to certain degrees of this sort of stuff through mum and the way she felt about things, and I could sort of read between the lines as to what was going on with the social engineering, although I didn't articulate it as such at the time and didn't realize how far it would go.
Yeah.
But you know, we
Well,
thought
she
it
sounds
was,
very wise.
yeah, I think she was, in many ways. And funnily enough, she was born into a military family. My grandfather, both my maternal grandparents were in the Royal Air Force. My grandfather was a pilot in the Royal Air Force, and my grandmother was in the WAF, in the Women's Royal Air Force. So, but I think
Oh,
I
you're going to
dodged.
get called a shill for that,
Well,
Amanda,
yes, I know,
revealing that.
but I think I dodged a bullet because we certainly weren't into the other side of that we've now uncovered through the research that we've done. We lived a fairly normal life and a fairly normal, you know. So my grandparents were probably just as in the dark as what we are. They were very low level. They weren't up there in the forces. But I often think now that I know what I know about the military industrial complex and what goes on with military families and the SRA and all that, how lucky was I? Because I was born in Yorkshire, the Yorkshire Moors, just a short distance from the golf balls. And we were told at the time that they were nuclear power plants or something like that. But I've often wondered since I've done my research what they actually are and what goes on in there and under there. So, but that's a whole other
Yeah.
story for a whole other
Well,
show.
military families are the key to so much. It seems
Yes.
the offspring of high-ranking military officials get co-opted into these social engineering programs, and so often that's in the entertainment industry. It
Yeah.
might be as actors or TV stars as well as musicians, but they get selected for these roles by virtue of the fact that they're just born into the wrong families, military families.
Yeah.
You did touch on a couple of things there that I just wanted to expand on. You mentioned that the male's natural role in society has been as a provider, and the female has been the nurturer.
Hmm.
These are mother and father archetypes, if you like. And
Yep.
that's the way it is in nature, because that's the way it was decreed by the creator, you know, the
Hmm.
creative force, the Most High. And so these social engineering agendas that we have now are all about subverting that, of course, emasculating males, making females have more masculine traits, and to turn these traditional roles on their heads. This is what was going on in the 60s with the so-called feminist movement. It was trying to get women out of the home, away from these traditional nurturing roles, taking care of the family, into the workplace where they could be just like men and contributing to the taxation system at the same time. So a double whammy for the controllers.
Yep.
But it was all about, you know, turning those traditional roles on their heads. But we get reminders from time to time of the fact that there are masculine and feminine archetypes and traits. And we've really seen that over the past 3 years, because I've noticed that so many of the organizers of the freedom rallies and marches that we've had in the UK, or these activist groups that have been set up, or these conferences and meetup groups that have been organized, have been women. Women have really stepped up in the last 2.5, 3 years,
Yep.
and they've put many men to shame. There are many men who should have been taking more active roles and should have been rising up, resisting, you know, fighting back against the tyranny that's been so obvious in our lives. But it's the women that have been doing it. Their efforts have really impressed me. And it's brought to mind the fact that this is the nurturing, motherly aspect of care, that feminine trait of care, which has come to the fore and is driving these behaviors, because these women are seeing potential threats to them and their families, their children, and they're saying, we're not having this. We're fighting back. We're doing whatever it takes to protect us and our families. And that's a really impressive thing. And unfortunately, so many males have been emasculated to the point that they've not risen up in the same way that the women have. And it's just a reminder of the fact that we've got these natural inclinations within us. They're trying to blur the genders. They're trying to make everything homogenized and everything the same. But nature has a different idea. Nature has ideas about what constitutes a real man and what constitutes a real woman. And you can never destroy that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, it's like the lionesses come out in all the women, especially when it comes to the children, for sure. Yeah, and the whole gender agenda, it's just ridiculous. Like now when you've got a survey or something or paperwork to fill out, and it's got, do you identify as male, female, non-binary, other? I'm thinking, well, what is other? What is non-binary? Like, there's only
It's
two
mental
genders.
illness.
Yeah,
It's mental illness by any other name. And in previous
yep,
epochs, it would have been correctly defined as mental illness.
yeah, exactly. It's just bizarre. Yeah. So with the decades, like, so we've gone from the 60s with the sort of the beginnings, I guess, of well, I guess the social engineering was probably happening decades before that, but that's when we really noticed a big switch, wasn't it? Because up until then, you go to the 50s and you still had good family values. There was in America, they call it, apple pie and all that sort of stuff. And then you get to the 60s and you've got screaming women at these four mop tops and things like that, and the parents were horrified, and that was another thing I wanted to mention too, with regards to how when something is pushed as a certain thing, people just go along with it. Like, I do enjoy some of the Beatles music, and I do have some of their records, and I've got mainly John Lennon records, but I could never understand growing up. I mean, the Beatles was more mum's era, but they were sort of still in my periphery when I was growing up. I could never understand this thing about, oh, the Beatles, they were the greatest band ever, they were the greatest songwriters and this and that. And you listen to the music, especially the earlier stuff before Sergeant Pepper's, and it just doesn't compute to me. It's like, how can you say that they're great songwriters when they're singing songs like "She Loves You," yeah, 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 like just like Cat, not, oh yeah, Cat Stevens, but Al Stewart, "Year of the Cat" was the one I was thinking of. Songs like that, that have got a bit more depth to it and a bit more melody and melodic rhythm and things like that. They're great songs, but some of the Beatles stuff was just absolute shite. And yet they were just pushed on society as the greatest thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's what they do. They'll present the public with a band and they'll say, this band is great. This band is the best thing since sliced bread. And
Yeah.
because people are told that, they just embrace it. They just accept it. I can remember when Lady Gaga's career was launched,
Yeah, no.
and people were saying, oh, she's going to be the next big thing. She's the next Madonna,
Yeah.
which is actually a cousin of Madonna, which is probably the reason for it.
Yeah.
But it had already been decided before her career launched that she was going to be a really big pop star, because these things are decided for us by Edward Bernays, the master propagandist, the father of public relations. Mentioned that our lives, our tastes, our opinions are shaped and molded for us largely by men we've never heard of.
Yep.
That's the social engineers working from behind the shadows. So the reason the Beatles were lauded as this great band and the best band out there is simply because people had been told that they were. And
Yep.
so they went with it.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So do you have any other little sound bites from your books that you'd like to share with us today? Like any intel into certain people in the music industry, or the connections between different people in the music industry that some of my listeners might not have known about before?
Well, we can certainly get into some of those. Yeah. It was interesting about the decades, though, that you mentioned, how different agendas have tended to be pushed in different decades. And we really see this through music.
Yeah.
And I know that Crow, 777, and Jason did a series where they looked at each decade in turn and examined what was getting pushed on the public then. And that was some fascinating work. And when you look at popular music through the decades, you can clearly see certain styles, certain trends, certain ideas being pushed in the different decades. So I really started my research in the mid 1950s, because prior to that point, as you mentioned, there were sort of traditional family values still in place. And when you look at the music charts, which first launched in Britain in November 1952, you have ballads and crooners and sort of post-war styles of music, very, very different to rock music. The very first #1 in the UK was Here in My Heart by El Martino, which is this, ballad that sounds very, very dated. But then by the mid 1950s, you had the emergence of rock and roll. Bill Haley and his Comets, Rock Around the Clock, and then Elvis Presley coming out, and then Little Richard and Buddy Holly and Eddie Cochran and all these kinds of acts, Chuck Berry. And so that was the 1950s. And that birthed the emergence of the teenager, the concept of the teenager. Because prior to the mid 50s, there was no such term as teenager.
No, they
It
were
was just children.
adolescents. Children,
Yeah, right.
adolescents. Yeah.
Children, adolescents, then young adults. And
Yeah.
the idea of the teenager coincided with this idea of liberation through lifestyle and culture. So you had artists like Elvis Presley that would have girls screaming at concerts and losing their minds before the Beatles did, and throwing their knickers on stage and all this sort of thing. And so it was vastly different to all these traditional austere values which had gone before. And of course, this was intended. This was put into place by the culture creators. And then in the 60s, you had the emergence of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones the year after. So you had a dialectic there. If the Beatles were a bit too lightweight and soft for you, and you liked your bands more edgy and dangerous, well, then the Rolling Stones were your guys. But both bands were controlled ultimately. That led to the British invasion, so-called, in America, where bands such as the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and the Animals and the Who were getting repackaged and sold back to the American public, when actually they were taking American rhythm and blues music and exporting it back to the place that it originated from. That was the so-called British invasion. But the only reason these bands were so enthusiastically accepted in the United States was, again, because they were, the Americans were told that these bands are great and you need to embrace them. And of course they did. They were rife for manipulation. Nobody in the 60s knew about social engineering and how these dynamics work. We can know about it now, but nobody did back then. So the 60s evolved, and bands such as the Beatles and the Rolling Stones played their part in pushing the psychedelic culture, which came in the second part of the 60s. That's when all the LSD came in out of the CIA. That's when all these changing attitudes to culture and traditional family values came in. And then by the end of the 60s, it's very interesting that the Beatles were done effectively by the end of 1969. They officially broke up in 1970, the year I was born, so I just missed them. But the Beatles were all washed up and finished by 1969. So they were very much a product of the 60s. They were used to push these agendas that the 1960s was there for. And by the 70s, we had new forms of rock music coming in. So you had bands like Pink Floyd, who had previously pushed psychedelic sort of acid culture in London. They then went into their progressive rock phase under the influence of Dave Gilmour. And you had Dark Side of the Moon and all these other albums. You had bands like Led Zeppelin coming through, Deep Purple, Black Sabbath.
That they were all my bands.
Right.
Yeah,
So
they're all
it was prog rock, progressive rock. By the mid 60s, there was this sort of backlash, engineered backlash, it turns out, against these sort of rock dinosaurs as they were perceived. I mean, prior to that, you had like David Bowie and Elton John and the glam rock movement, of course. But by 1976, Britain was ready for the punk movement, spearheaded by the Sex Pistols, controlled very much by Malcolm McLaren, who was the driving force behind that band. And this was aimed at the young people of the time. That generation were in the crosshairs, and they were being coerced into thinking of all these tired old rock bands as irrelevant, and youth culture wanted something new. So that's where punk culture came in, and that gave birth to new wave and all these punk post-punk styles of music.
Yep, like
And that was very
Blondie
much,
and
sorry.
Blondie was in that.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
And the Police,
yeah.
which is a CIA manufactured band.
They were
When you get
another
down to it,
band I loved in high school. I've got all the Police records, and
right?
yeah, and now I look back and I just go, oh my God, why didn't I see it? Why didn't I actually put together Sting, Police?
The
Just
Police,
even just that.
yeah, because
Yeah,
they were there to police all the other bands in the scene.
yeah,
Through the Copeland family,
mm,
CIA family, which ran that band. So
yeah,
anyway, then you had the 1980s, and the 80s were all about synth pop when that decade first got going, electronic styles of music. And the way had been paved for that by certain artists in the 70s, like Jean-Michel Jarre, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, who were sort of experimenting with synths. Actually, Pink Floyd did on the track On the Run on the Dark Side of the Moon album.
I
So
think
that was like a precursor.
Alan Parsons did
Yeah,
too a
true.
lot, didn't he? Yeah,
Yeah, true.
yeah,
And then Gary Newman at the end of the 1970s, and that was paving the way for synth pop and synthesizers and electronic music. And by the end of the 80s, you had the emergence of electronic dance music, acid house culture that I mentioned, and then you're into the 90s and all the rest of it. But that's a quick sort of whistle stop tour through certain fads, trends, and scenes through the decades. And all of them, when you get down to the research, can be shown to have been manufactured. These
yep,
fads, these trends, these movements don't just come along and sweep up millions of people and influence the way they dress, the way they behave, the way they socialize, the way they dance. It doesn't just happen naturally. And
yep,
I think my work of the past several years has shown this. And I offer citations and references throughout, because these are wild statements to just come out with if you can't back them up. But that's what citations are there for. And that's why when you look at my books, you find pages and pages and pages at the end of each chapter showing where I got the information from. And I'm far from the only one doing this now. There's many researchers uncovering all this stuff. And in 2022, we can know exactly how culture creation works, and we should know.
yep.
But those in previous decades didn't stand a chance because they didn't have the opportunities that we do now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's funny too, I think I heard you say in one of your recent interviews, with going with the decades, we get to, I think it's the 90s or into the 2000s, and then everything seems to just be so homogenized now. You can't even put your finger on what it is. I mean, at least in the other decades, you had, okay, the 60s was the hippie era, the 70s was the rock, the 80s was the, the synthetic, the synth coming in, and the
Yeah.
parties, and the 90s was the grunge. But you get to the 2000s up to now, and it's just a mishmash of that. There's no real, it's almost that they've reached the absolute bottom of the dung heap, that it's just sludge now. And there's, yeah,
Yeah. You're
yeah,
absolutely right. I mean, the major artist coming out of the UK for the past several years has been Ed Sheeran,
mm,
which tells you pretty much everything you need to know about where the music scene is at, because that guy is just blandness personified for me.
yeah,
And yet he's lauded
exactly.
as the greatest thing out there. I don't even know how you would classify his music apart from
No,
incredibly boring.
yeah.
But a few years ago, he swept the board at the MOBO Awards in London. This is music of black origin. So it used to be R&B singers or
Yep.
rappers or jazz artists that would pick up those awards. But Ed Sheeran got like 4 or 5 awards. There's nothing black about his music. There are no black
No.
music influences in there. And as you say, everything's now homogenized. You used to be able to point to a record and say, oh, that's a house record, electronic dance, techno, rap, hip hop. Now you can't, because they're all sort of merged together and it all sounds horrific. There's auto tune
Oh,
everywhere.
yeah. I hate auto-tune.
I know. It's normalizing transhumanism and AI.
Yeah.
That's what it's there for. It's
Yeah.
getting young people used to robotic, cyborg sounding voices, because that's where they want to take society, where
Yeah.
everything's digital, everything's electronically controlled.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, yeah, so the sound bites, did you want to share anything from your books? Like connections? Just give us a couple of little tidbits there.
Well, yeah, I've got some family connection stuff, which kind of explains where some of these artists come from. So one example is Chris Martin of Coldplay, who are another band that I personally find amazingly boring, stupendously boring. And yet they've been hailed as this amazing group, and they sort of came out of nowhere and achieved overnight success. Turns out that Chris Martin's grandfather, I think it was, this is in Musical Truth 3, was the one-time mayor of Exeter. And this put me in mind of Peter Gabriel of Genesis. I'm sure you're going to tell me that's another group you used to like.
Yes. Yes.
I thought it would be.
Yep.
So Peter Gabriel, they come from incredibly posh families, actually, Genesis. They were birthed out of Charterhouse School in Godalming, Surrey, this very exclusive sort of public boys' school. And they're said to have been discovered by Jonathan King, who later went on to a career as a BBC presenter and has since been exposed as a prolific paedophile and friend of
Surprise,
Jimmy Savile.
surprise.
I know, what a bloody surprise, eh?
Yep.
I'll have to be careful not to get too sidetracked here, because I tend to go off in all kinds of different tangents. But Genesis, yeah, an incredibly posh group. And Peter Gabriel from an aristocratic family. Turns out that I think it was a great uncle or something like that, was a baronet, and he was the one-time Lord Mayor of London. So you start to find these connections everywhere, where one generation of a family will be put into politics, or there'll be a diplomat, or it'll be some expression of government or the establishment. And then a couple of generations down the line, one of their descendants emerges as a rock star. And you start to realize that these careers are carved out for them. I mean, Bono, who you mentioned earlier,
Yep.
his real name is Paul David Hewson. And in Musical Truth 3, I've tracked back his family bloodline many, many generations to 16th century Britain. So the Hewitson family, as they used to be known, emerged out of England. And there was a patriarch of that family who decided to relocate to Ireland. And so all successive generations of the Hewitsons, which became the Hewsons, came out of Ireland. And Bono had a cousin named Barbara Hewson, who was an Irish lawyer. And one of her claims to fame was that she campaigned for the age of consent for adults to be able to have sex with children to be lowered to the age of 13.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, you've got Bono, her cousin, who's pushing New World Order agendas. So he's trying to advance the United Nations Agenda 2030. He's got his One Foundation, which is one of these NGOs connected to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the UN and the WHO. So Bono's effectively a bagman for the so-called elite control system, and he's just trying to advance all their agendas. So there you've got the Hewson family, where one cousin, one descendant of that family is put out there as a lawyer campaigning for the age of consent to be lowered. So she's influencing society in a certain way. And then Bono, her cousin, is also influencing society as a rock musician getting people all caught up with the music of U2, but also as a mate of Bill Gates and George Soros and all these other so-called globalists. He's doing that work as well. And so you realize that so many of these people are not so much rock stars. They're more pushers of, one world order agendas. Same thing with Bob Geldof. Bob Geldof was the lead singer of the Boomtown Rats, this Irish new wave group, but that was just to get him established and known as a celebrity, as a public figure, so that his real work could continue some way down the line. And that started with the Band Aid and the Live Aid projects of the 1980s. And since then, we've seen that Geldof, like Bono, has been pushing these globalist agendas. And he's very much a tool, a stooge of the system, pushing any agenda going. And we get it with Sting, with Peter Gabriel, Annie Lennox, all these people have got involved in these projects. And I used to think that it made them great people. It's like you were saying about Bono earlier. I used to look at somebody like Sting or Peter Gabriel, and I think, oh, this is great. These are rock stars that have all this money and all this wealth, but they care. They're getting involved in all these projects. And I didn't realize back then that these projects, don't have humanity's best interests at heart. They're not benevolent. They're being weaponized against the rest of us. So it's not a noble thing to ally yourself to one of these projects, as I used to think, is actually a deeply harmful thing when you get down to it. That's the truth of the music industry. It's very harsh, it's very unsettling, it's very unwelcome, but you either want the truth or you don't.
Yeah, exactly. And there are some, it reminded me when you said about Bob Geldof, because there was that whole thing with his partner Paula Yates and then Michael Hutchence and that whole thing.
There's
and
an Australia link there.
and then Michael ended up dead in a Sydney hotel room at the back of the door. So I think anyone
on the 22nd of November, incidentally. So it's the same date that Dave McGowan died, and it's the anniversary of the Kennedy assassination. Quite the coincidence.
Yes. So, and there are so many in the music industry that have, either been suicided or taken out, or, some of them, I guess, because they get mixed up with the wrong people. Others it's because they are starting to speak out or try and expose the truth, or they're breaking free of their programming. But nearly every band that you can think of, some of it could be sacrifices. A lot of people, like normie people, would be horrified to know, but there's a lot of sacrifice that goes on for these bands that get to the heights of fame and fortune. But there's a price to pay. I mean, you've got AC/DC that lost Bon Scott, you've got Led Zeppelin, John Bonham, nearly everyone that you can think of.
Well, pretty much every major band that's had a big influence on culture has lost one of their band members in untimely and suspicious circumstances.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, and then there's the 27 Club as well. So, yeah. And I think some of them probably do just disappear and then morph into other lives and go into some sort of witness protection or something or other.
Absolutely,
but others actually do, end up meeting their sort of, maker. So, yeah.
That's right. I've got sections on that in Musical Truth 1, where I look at the deaths of a group of very well-known artists and just look into the circumstances surrounding it. So I'm looking into John Lennon, Bob Marley, Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Kurt Cobain, Amy Winehouse. Most of those are members of the 27 Club. Also Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones. And it's like you say, in some cases, I do feel that these individuals didn't die at the time we're told they did. I just think the public role has been retired and they've been allowed to go into some sort of CIA witness protection program type scenario. I personally feel that was the case with Jim Morrison, who we're told turned up dead in a bathtub in his Paris apartment on the 3rd of July 1971. I personally feel that Jim, being the son of the Navy Admiral, was allowed to retire Jim Morrison, the iconic rock god, and just take on some other identity and live out his remaining years. I personally feel that Elvis Presley didn't die when we're told he did as well in
He's apparently a
1977.
reverend somewhere now, isn't he?
Yeah, Bob Joyce, Pastor Bob
That's right,
Joyce.
yeah.
Yeah.
And Jim Morrison was was he a DJ?
Wasn't he supposed to become Rush Limbaugh, according
That's
to
it.
some?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's it.
I don't
Yeah.
buy that one
It's
myself, but
yeah.
so you got artists like that, and I've got my doubts about whether they actually died at the time. Then you got the likes of John Lennon, and I've always leaned towards Lennon genuinely being assassinated
I think
in
so too.
1980 when
Yeah.
we're told he did. You know, some will claim that that wasn't the real John Lennon. Some will claim that in some way the assassination was a hoax, but I've always leaned towards that being real. And then Bob Marley was basically given a form of cancer.
Mm.
We're told that he broke his toe playing football and gangrene set in, and it led to this fast acting cancer spreading through his body. But there's a different story about how Bob Marley came to contract that cancer, which is in the book. And I personally feel that Bob Marley was a threat to the system because he was so politically active and he galvanized and motivated many people to take on
Yep.
anti-establishment values. He had to go.
Yep.
And that's the case with many of the others. Jimi Hendrix was murdered on the orders of his manager, Michael Jeffrey. Janis Joplin seemingly was killed because she knew about what happened to Jimi Hendrix. So she died only about 3 weeks after Hendrix. They just had to get rid of her to shut her up. So I think you need to look at each case in isolation and try and work out what happened. Whitney Houston, that was a ritual sacrifice.
Yep.
They got rid of her. In a ritualistic fashion, in line with their sick, twisted sort of occult belief system. And Avicii, the dance music producer and DJ, I believe was got rid of. We were told that he committed suicide, but I'm not buying that. And Amy Winehouse was got rid of as well. So you have to look at the circumstances in each case. Certainly, ritual sacrifice happens. Michael Jackson and Prince, I believe, fall into that category. They'd
Yep.
also become a bit of a pain in the ass to the control system. They'd become outspoken. In Michael Jackson's case, I believe his mind control programming was starting to wear off and he was becoming too unpredictable and he was making too many statements which the controllers didn't like. So they had to get rid of him. And George Michael, I feel, falls into that category as well. So there's lots to it. You can't make a sweeping blanket statement and say that none of these artists die when we're told they did. You can't say that they were all ritually sacrificed or murdered. Some of them were, some of them weren't. It
Yep.
takes a lot of detective work and really delving into the detail of each one.
Yeah. And even with the research, it can take you down so many paths. I mean, like the whole Paul is dead, that you've kind of not flip-flopped on. You realize that the guy that we see now is not the original Paul McCartney, but the original way that you looked at it, you've now, done a bit more research and found that there could be other possibilities. Yeah, so it is something that, yeah, we have to be really discerning and we have to really do the research. And I think sometimes it's good to even say that we don't know. It's good to have ideas of what might have happened or what might be happening, but it's okay to say, well, we really don't know unless we're actually viewing it for ourselves, because there's
That's
so
right.
much. Because Mike Williams, the Sage of Quay, who's one of the big key researchers in the whole Paul is dead, research community. I've lost my train of thought there. What was I saying?
Well, yeah, he's got a
That's it.
very solid line on the McCartney situation.
Yep.
And he's convinced that the guy we have today is William Shepherd, Billy Shears. It's not the
Yep.
original Paul.
Yep.
And we haven't seen the original Paul since 1966.
Yep.
And I love Mike's work. I greatly respect him. He's an impeccable researcher and he presents it in a really good way. And I respect his viewpoint on
Yep. I
this.
remember what I was going
My,
to say. Sorry
yeah,
for butting in. Yeah, as he says, there's a lot of photos that have been doctored. So even when we're looking at photos online now, they could be a composite of the original and then maybe one or two of others that have played that role. So it's hard to
well, yeah.
say. Yeah.
this is the thing. It is made so difficult for us to research this stuff accurately because there is tampering, there is doctoring that goes on. There's lots of manipulations and deception and sneaky trickery that they get up to try and obfuscate the facts. So Mike has that very solid line on the McCartney situation, and I would love to have it as clear cut as that in my own mind, because it would just help me make it through the day much easier. What confuses the hell out of me, and I don't mind admitting that I'm confused, is the fact that there are photographs and video footage from the years beyond 1966, you know, much more recent years, which appear to show the original Paul. And that's why I'm certain that there have been at least 2 Paul McCartneys presented to us, but I can't be sure that the guy we have today is not the original biological Paul. He may well be. I know there's been 2, probably more, but there's been a lot of swapping in and out over the years, it would seem. You know, Mike would say that that's down to the doctoring of photos and video footage and stuff, and it may well be. But my position on it is simply that I don't know. And I'm open to different possibilities. And I do respect researchers who will come out and say, I actually don't know what's going on here. There's strangeness, there's anomalies, there's discrepancies, none of it adds up, and I just don't know what's happening. I can respect somebody like that, because somebody who has a concrete minded view on something and they never deviate one iota from it, I've got to be suspicious of what their motives might be. Not Mike, by the way, I'm talking about others. But
well, because Mike's always bringing new things in anyway, and he'll always open up the floor to more, you know, possibilities and things like that. He's definitely very objective and you know, like
well, he's one of the best out there, and he's one of only a few that I can trust now, to be honest. You know, there's so many truth researchers and broadcasters, you know, big names that I just can't trust anymore, because they've led me off in you know, deceptive directions.
Exactly.
Mike's one I can trust, but there aren't many others, got to tell you.
That's why I really like Crow 777 as well, Jason and Crow, because they really do solid research, and if it's just an opinion, they'll say it's an opinion, but if they found something solidly, they'll present that, but they'll always leave it up to our interpretation. They don't have an agenda, they don't have a certain lane and stick to that one lane. So and you're
they're
the
doing
same.
great work as well. Great shows.
They are. Absolutely, and very helpful. That's what I like about them too, is that with all the doom and gloom that we've been through in the last few years, it's good to have a lot of people out there now that are actually coming up with ways that we can navigate, you know, these rough waters, and things that we can do for our health, mental health, physical health, spiritual health, and things like that. So so I guess sort of winding up here, because we're coming to sort of to the end of our time. What speaking engagements or what things have you got coming up? And do you want to talk about your new book and its release?
Yeah, so the project I've got on the go at the moment is that I'm recording and editing the audiobook version of Musical Truth 3. So that book's been out for about a year in printed form and in Kindle form.
Got that
and
one here.
I want to get, there you go, that's it.
Yep.
And I want to get the audiobook version of that onto Audible by January. I've got a big battle on my hands because it's hugely time consuming to do one of these. It's not the recording of it, it's the editing of all the audio afterwards and taking out all the little glitches and stuff. But I do still have aspirations to get the audiobook out by January, February. And as soon as I've done that, I'm going to launch into the writing of the next book, which is going to be another novel. I really enjoyed the process of writing The Cause and the Cure, which I refer to. I'm sure you've got a copy of that. There you go. That's it. Yeah. This is truth fiction. So you can get away with saying all kinds of things under the guise of fiction, as in the memoirs of Billy Shears, that you would have trouble passing off in a book that's presented as non-fiction. So for a while, I've wanted to do a sequel to The Cause and the Cure. It's going to be called The Gift and the Curse, after a Jay-Z album title. And this story is going to be set in the city of Oxford, again, which is where the first story was set. That's my city of birth. And it really is Illuminati Central, Oxford. You know, it's where all the elite types go to get their indoctrination and training.
Yep.
So it's going to be set at the time of 9/11 in September 2001. It's going to feature many of the same characters from the first book, and I'm really looking forward to getting the writing of that done. So I'm aiming to get that book out by the end of 2023. And then after that, I'll be doing another non-fiction book, but that's as far ahead as I'm looking at the moment. And in terms of speaking engagements, I've had an incredible year in 2022 where I've been all over the UK. I've done about 59 talks, I think, this year. So that's more than one a week. And I've really enjoyed it. I've reached new audiences. These events are always good for networking with like-minded people and just getting empowering, truthful information out there. And so I'm going to be doing more of that through 2023 in the UK and maybe a few overseas spots as well. So it depends how easy it is to get into certain nations without, you know, succumbing to all this madness and insanity. There's certain countries that I can now travel to, and there's certain ones that I can't. So I can't get into America at the moment without one of these.
Yep.
So I won't be going there anytime soon. But I do see that Australia at the moment is allowing foreigners to come in without one of these and all the rest of it. So I am considering the feasibility of doing that Australia speaking tour, mini tour, that I had planned for March 2020 in October 2023. So only 3.5 years late.
Yep.
Better late than never.
It is, yep.
So I'm wondering if it might be possible for me to hit Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Perth in October. It depends what madness comes our way in the intervening months. Who knows how 2023 is going to pan out. But in the back of my mind is the idea that I might be able to make that happen. And I'm going to try and will and manifest that into place.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds fantastic. Yeah, can't wait for that. Yeah, fingers crossed. Yeah, all the madness is behind it. Well, most of the madness, it's always going to be this way, I think, for a long time until, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Who
The last
knows?
time I was in Australia was
Yeah.
2009 for a DJing trip. So it really is time I came back.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And you've got a lot of fan base here and a lot of people that yeah, they were so disappointed that you couldn't get, but understood, you know, why you couldn't get here in 2020. But yeah, so all right then. So where can people find your work online, like the podcasts and YouTube and things like that? So you just want to drop your details?
Sure. Well, the main hub website, which connects to everything else, is djmarkdevlin.com. And there's details of my books, and you can access all my podcasts from there. So at the moment, I'm on my 3rd YouTube channel, and I've managed to retain it so far. I am chucking everything up on it at the moment because I was just putting little teasers and being careful about what I said. And I reached a point where I just said, you know, F it. I'm just going to throw everything up on that channel and see what happens. So at the moment, it's still there. Who knows how long it will last. But other than that, I'm on BitChute and Odyssey as sort of backups. And all my content is on there. On my Odyssey channel, all my content going back to 2008 is on there, because that one mirrored my original YouTube channel. I'm starting a Rumble channel very soon. I'm going to put all my content on Rumble as well. And then I've got Mixcloud for my Sound of Now, which is my weekly Soulful House music show, and also my Sound of Freedom conscious music show. Both of those are hosted on Mixcloud, and my audio podcasts and interviews are on Spreaker. The books are on Amazon, but you can also get copies from me direct. And I think you've still got a few copies there, haven't you, for
I
for
do,
anyone in
yes,
Australia?
absolutely, yes. So anyone in Australia and New Zealand, we've got Musical Truth 1, Musical Truth 2, Volume 3, and we've got The Cause and the Cure. So yeah, I've got plenty of copies of Mark's books here in
Right.
Australia, so I can mail those out probably cheaper than you can from over there to
Oh, a
anyone
lot
in,
cheaper. Yeah.
to anyone here in Australia and New Zealand. So if you contact myself at A_McLeod, MCLEOD 7@hotmail.com, or you can contact Mark. So Mark, what's your email address?
So my email address is markdevlinuk@gmail.com.
Okay, so anyone else throughout the world that wants to order directly through Mark, even though it's available on Amazon, the books are available on Amazon, but it's probably better for you to deal with people directly. Although it's quite easy with Amazon, but yeah, that's
Well, I do say to people in the US that you're better off ordering from Amazon because it's so costly for me to mail out, unfortunately, to the
yeah,
US because all the postal companies hiked up their prices during COVID. So it
yes,
costs more than the book itself to post it to America.
yes,
But certainly UK and Europe get them from me.
yeah.
Australia and New Zealand get them from Amanda.
Yeah, great. All right. Well, thanks so much. It's been such an honor to have you on today. And yeah, I don't know why we didn't do this sooner, but I guess you've been busy, I've been busy, and yeah, but we've
And the
kept you.
bloody time zones
I know,
causing problems as well.
I know. What's it now? 10 hours at the moment, I think, isn't it? Yeah, because
Yeah,
you're,
well, it's
yeah.
11 in the morning here, so I'm about to start my day and you're about to go to bed.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much, Mark. And as I said, I'll get this up probably over the weekend and put it up next week sometime. And yeah. And
Great. Well, thanks
yeah.
for getting me on. I thought it was a really worthwhile chat. Really enjoyed it.
Yes. Great. Thank you so much. All right. Take
All
care.
right.
And
Cheers.
yeah. All right. Bye.
Bye.